Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome Seaver Wang. He is the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. Seaver, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to talk about Fukushima Daiichi, and we're going to talk about a lot of other things. But Seaver, you haven't been on the podcast before. Guests, and I didn't warn you. I warned some guests, others I just simply ambush. And here's the ambush. Guests on this program introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, imagine you've arrived somewhere. You have you don't know anyone. You have about 60 seconds, and you need to explain who you are and why you're there. Well, you know why you're there. We already explained why you're here. Just who you are. So please introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Again, pleasure to be here. Thanks so much again for having me. So as Robert said, I'm co-director of the Climate and Energy Research Program at the Breakthrough Institute. So at the Breakthrough Institute, my research covers sort of a gamut of topics related to energy, decarbonization, clean energy. Primarily, my group is most focused on supply chains for low carbon technologies, on everything from mining to manufacturing, to sort of how all this stuff gets sort of integrated, built. These projects sort of get constructed, interconnected. And in addition to that, I also have a very strong interest in climate and energy policy in the East Asia region. And sort of also relevant for, I guess, some of the topics we're going to be talking about today, I sort of came to clean energy more recently. So in my prior background, I actually was formally trained as an oceanographer. I got my doctorate in Earth and Ocean Sciences from Duke University, finished that up in 2019 before coming to Breakthrough as an analyst. So I also sort of can speak to some of the concerns around sort of environmental and sort of ecological impacts, or in this case, lack thereof.
Sure. Well, let's start. There are a lot of things. I want to talk about supply chains and mining. I know you did a critique of Simon Michaud's work, supply chains, particularly with regard to solar and Uyghur slave labor. But just last week, the Japanese government, really it would be TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, started releasing water from Fukushima Daiichi, the power plant in Fukushima Prefecture. And this has been very controversial. The Chinese government has banned now imports of all seafood from Japan into China. And China has been the biggest importer of, or the biggest importer, right, of Japanese seafood. So now I can read the politics in a couple of different ways, but let's start with the water itself. And I was in Fukushima. I was at Fukushima Daiichi in February. I saw it myself. The quantities of water are just staggeringly large. Tell us about the tritiated water and why, in as briefly as you can, because we could talk about this for years, why there's been so much upset about this release of this tritiated water.
Sure. So let's start with sort of what the release is, like what magnitudes we're talking about, because
Sure.
I think some people sort of envision just a mass dumping. But this is actually a very controlled sort of release program, with a absolute maximum of just 50,000 liters per day. And it's anticipated to take place over the next 30 years. So we're talking about a very controlled sort of release, which is precisely sort of designed to ensure that environmental risks are negligible. And then, this is also not untreated water. This water has been through the Advanced Liquids Processing System, the ALPS system. And what that involves is several steps of sort of chemical processing, specifically iron co-precipitation and carbonate co-precipitation, to remove some of the heavier radionuclides, and then also pass through a bunch of physical and mechanical filtering as well. And then finally, after it's been through the ALPS system, the treated water is then further diluted with seawater to really make sure that the levels of radionuclides that are contained in the release are much closer to the level of ambient seawater already. And just based on sort of physics, we would understand that at the concentration of tritium that would be in the release, around 1,500 becquerels per liter, within just 2 kilometers from the plant, from the point of release, it would have diluted to the natural level of tritium in seawater in that region, which is around 1 becquerel per liter.
Now, we can. I'm puzzled. I'm thinking in my head, okay, how much do we get into sieverts and becquerels and those other metrics, right? And let's put that aside for just a minute, because you have been on Twitter very actively saying, hey, you bring me some of this, I'll drink it, right? And one of the reasons that you're doing this is that the Friends of the Earth, one of the many anti-nuclear NGOs on the planet that have enormous budgets, and they are outspending the pro-nuclear groups by my estimate of 14-1. I wrote about this on my Substack recently. But one of the most outrageous statements came from Berkeley City Council member Kate Harrison, who said, I've just pulled it up. You had quoted her tweet where she said the claim, she said the release, quote, could impact millions of lives and livelihoods in the Pacific region, and, quote, imposes considerable risks to environmental and human rights around the globe, and that that was it. And that it imposes considerable risks. I mean, this is the hyperbole here is just like, I don't know. You said, you were quite gentle here. You said that this amounts to nothing but sheer political theater. I don't know. I would use a word that were the initials BS, but I mean, where does this kind of insanity around radiation come from? I mean, this kind of, this is going to impact millions. And again, this could be a long discussion, but where does this kind of this insane rhetoric come from? What is the source of this? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think so. The one way I put it in that letter to the Berkeley City Council was that, Berkeley is a town where, every few lawns you have that sign, in this house we believe in science, and
Right.
yet you have this sort of discrepancy here with a Berkeley City Council member sort of just I making up her own science.
We believe in science, except for the science that doesn't agree with our kind of stupid belief about radiation, or what have we been told about stupid fear of radiation. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, not at all. But this treated water, it's been tested by the Japanese government and then independently verified and tested through the IAEA using the exact same tests to really make sure that we're doing the exact same methods. And we expect to find the exact same results. And indeed, IAEA has also verified sort of the effectiveness of this water treatment regime. And now, so I think there is two things that really sort of hold people back. One is sort of just style of communication. The IAEA can be very sort of wonky and we have consulted with stakeholders and we have this process and we do these treatments, but it's not communicated in a way that's very sort of able to resonate with a member of the general public. And the Japanese government sort of unfortunately also has just some idiosyncrasies in communication styles, like really old websites. There's a language barrier for sort of Western commentators and journalists and NGO advocates. So there's part of it is just ineffective communication, and then a part of it I think is sort of conspiratorial. It's a very made for Hollywood sort of narrative. You have this company and they're saying that the pollution is fine, but we see this set up in zombie movies and pandemic movies all the time, and so it just people sort of naturally gravitate towards that narrative framing and are like, I don't trust the company. And the one thing I've been telling people to sort of flip that framing is to sort of compare it to it and to say, okay, so some people come to me and they're like, oh, well, scientists said that smoking was harmless in the 1960s and the 70s. And what I would say in response to that is, would you be willing to apply that same reasoning to COVID vaccines? Are you going to distrust the scientists there? So rather than being conspiratorial, let's actually look at the science. Let's actually look at what experiments are being done. Let's talk in chemical terms. in ecological terms about what the risks we're actually talking about, rather than making it this sort of conspiratorial narrative. Let's actually talk facts and sort of logic, and sort of frame that discussion around that.
Yeah, that makes sense. But is also part of it too, as we're talking about becquerels and sieverts and millisieverts and rems and these ideas around radiation. You can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it. That this is part of the general scientific illiteracy, right? The people don't understand these metrics. They don't understand what they mean and what level of threat they pose. So therefore, any level of radiation is dangerous because it's radiation. I mean, is that right to think about it that way as well?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, this sort of radiophobia is sort of a very common. Yeah, it does stem from some scientific illiteracy, but we see it in other areas too, like fear about genetically modified crops, for instance. You're literally just tweaking the proteins, the natural proteins that an organism is producing. Proteins are proteins. Decades and decades of scientific work has shown that if you consume crops that are modified, that have been genetically modified, there are no measurable health ill effects. But still you have that scientific illiteracy. And also I think part of it is kind of values based. It comes out of broader sort of environmental narratives about humans playing God and tinkering with forces that they shouldn't, etc. And so there's that.
And that nuclear is the ultimate in the Pandora's box, or the ultimate in the kind of the technology that we should not touch, and we should go back to nature, the wind solar narrative, etc. But there's also some geopolitical things here that I thought were very interesting, where the Chinese government, I'm reading from marineinsight.com, on Tuesday, I'm reading from this news report. China responded furiously with Wang Wenban, its foreign ministry spokesperson, accusing Tokyo of being selfish and also irresponsible by pressing ahead with the disposal of the water, saying the ocean must be treated as a common good for humanity and not as a sewer for Japanese nuclear contaminated water. Well, okay, so I read that and I think, well, this is pretty rich coming from China, which is building, 24 reactors now. I mean, this is a country that is embracing nuclear more than any other. And here the question then, so how much of this is China just kind of tweaking Japan, right? Because this is an opportunity, and these are longtime rivals that will never be friends, I don't think. How much of this is just the more political theater and hyperbole?
Yeah, this is entirely rhetoric. I mean, because setting aside tritium releases from nuclear power plants, China is in no position to be talking about polluting the global commons of the ocean. There's a notable science paper that I used to assign to students in my classes at Duke on sort of national burdens of marine plastic pollution, and China is one of the world's top polluters in terms of plastic pollution into the ocean. China's large fleet of coal plants is heavily responsible for mercury releases into the ocean. So if we're talking about a pollutant that actually poses human health risks, bioaccumulation risks in seafood, et cetera, it's really China's fleet of coal plants that we should be pointing the finger at. So it's purely hypocritical and just geopolitical rhetoric.
It's an interesting point about the coal plants, because I've only largely thought about China's coal plants, and they were permitting 2 new coal plants a week last year, according to Global Energy Monitor. But I hadn't thought about that part about the mercury. That's a valid point. So let's talk for just a minute, Seaver, because you have an interesting background, and I'll be honest, I haven't had many Chinese people or Chinese Americans on the Power Hungry podcast. So you have a unique view on China in that you're first generation Chinese American. Both your folks immigrated. You told me earlier, dad immigrated from China to come to school here in the United States, and your mom from Hong Kong. And then they met here in the U.S. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, that's right. So I was born in Seattle and grew up and raised in the U.S. But I have sort of mainland Chinese roots, and then the story of my mom's family is a little different, but also fairly common amongst Asian Americans, in that her family were sort of refugees after the communist takeover, originally moved from Fujian province in China to Hong Kong. And then, eventually, my mom was born in Hong Kong, and then her family sort of made their way to the US through schooling. And then my father and mother, they actually met in Seattle in 1989, around the time of the Chinese pro-democracy student movements. So they were both supporting the Tiananmen Square protesters from abroad, and actually happened to meet during those events. My mom was selling T-shirts, so my dad tells me.
Wow, that's a great story. She's selling T-shirts, and that's how they met. Well, so then how do you, I mean, just in broad terms, because I want to talk about what's the Uyghur issue and so on. How do you view what's happening in China today? Well, let me ask first. So did your folks speak Chinese when you were growing up in the house?
Oh, yeah. We spoke Mandarin in the household growing up. Yeah.
All right. So you spoke Mandarin, and so you speak Mandarin as well now?
Yes. Yeah. Not as, maybe not as well as I would like, but I can speak and understand TV programs and the like.
So you follow Chinese newspapers and news reports out of China. Just quickly, how do you see what's happening in China these days? Because, to me, as I look at it, I'm no foreign policy expert, but man, it's hard to understand what's going on, right? And Xi Jinping and the economic troubles and the theories about what might happen in China, and also was it Hu Jintao, Hu Jintao was at the meeting where they escorted him out. I thought it was kind of operatic, the whole thing, the way it happened. And it was just amazing as an outsider. I thought, man, that looks like a movie script. But I mean, how do you think about China today and what its future looks like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have one minor point and then two major points
Sure.
I want to make. The minor point is, you asked earlier if I, read Chinese newspapers and the like. I just want to make the minor clarification that I'm not professionally literate in Chinese. I can read at maybe a
Sure.
grade schooler level. And the first that leads into the first major point I want to make, which is that regardless of level of language proficiency or amount of time one has spent in China, I'm strongly of the opinion that if anyone claims to know exactly what's going on, they're trying to sell you something, or perhaps a little full of themselves.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people who I respect who know way more than I do about Chinese history, politics, energy policy, economic policy, et cetera. The mark of sort of a good China scholar is that they understand what they know and what they don't know. And sort of the don't knows in a government that fundamentally lacks a great deal of transparency, and that is ultimately only accountable to itself. What we don't know is very large.
Right.
So it's very hard to say. But I don't know if you're particularly interested in one aspect or another. You mentioned Uyghurs and supply chains, energy, economy.
Well, let's talk about the energy part of this, because a lot of people look at China and they just look at the electric generation part of the equation, because that tells them, and I think it is telling, right? Electric generation, electric demand is a very, very very closely correlated with economic growth. China's been, let's talk about coal plants. Why can't China, very straightforward question, why can't China quit coal?
Yeah, I mean, one reason why it's very difficult for China to quit coal is because, we talk about coal in the context of electricity, but for China, a large portion of their energy demand and a large portion of their coal consumption is actually industrial. Around a third of China's coal is burned actually in the industrial sector, for chemicals, for steel, for other metals, for heavy manufacturing, et cetera. So that makes it all of a sudden it's very tied to some of your key export industries, and right. So ramping down coal becomes a lot more complicated of a problem, because it suddenly is not just switching out electrons, but much more difficult to decarbonize industrial processes. And I'd also note that coal has sort of less so now, but sort of traditionally speaking, has also been tied into to other sectors of the economy as well. For example, domestic heating. Much of northern China, for example, previously used public district heating networks that were fueled by coal boilers, although those are being swapped out for electric boilers now. So coal is integrated into the economy much more than just the power sector. And then the power sector itself is just immense with the level of increase in sort of quality of living and sort of prosperity across China over the last few decades. Growth in power in power consumption has been, remarkable. We're talking like 5 to 10 percent growth in power generation per year over much of that period from
Sure.
1980 to the mid 2010s. So really sort of staggering growth in electricity demand as well, which has also driven coal demand. And then, in recent years, the power supply has been somewhat constrained in China. We've had droughts in southern China, which have impacted hydropower production. And then the Chinese system of interprovincial electricity sort of trading and transfer is very rigid and not very flexible when sort of contingencies like this arise. Which has left many provinces wanting to hold on to more reserve coal capacity to sort of ride out potential shortfalls in supply.
Because they can't count on their neighbors to give them power if they're short power.
Yeah, and that's not because their neighbors don't have the power, but it's because they prearrange how much power they trade, and those arrangements are rather rigid, so they can't be flexible when the need arises.
I see. So there's no spot market for power like there would be in the U.S. you could wheel power from one area to another that would then allow more flexibility in the overall system. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, interregional electricity trading is rather rigid. Yes.
Gotcha. So, well, another then, because you watch this and I've been watching it as well for now, a decade or so, just watching the staggering growth in demand and power in China, as well as the staggering growth in coal demand. Is this going to continue? Do you think it starts to level out? There are, differing, again, experts, right? Experts, anybody from out of town. That was what my dad said. But that the demographics are starting to slow down, that China faces a lot of challenges now. How do you read any of that? I mean, what's your take on this? And I grant neither of us are an expert, but you watch this closely as well. How do you read the tea leaves there? What do you think happens next? Is China just kind of destined for an economic slowdown after so many years of economic boom?
Yeah, that's a big question. Certainly, I think China faces very difficult economic policy challenges around shifting from their traditional sort of growth-oriented, construction-oriented growth model to a model that might be more sort of driven by consumer demand, et cetera. But I'm not a macroeconomist, so I won't dive too much into that. I think the future is hard to predict, and coal in China has both tailwinds and headwinds.
Yeah.
So in the headwinds category, reasons why China might end up reducing coal-related power emissions. Some of that is economic. If China goes into an economic downturn, sectors of the economy that have traditionally driven a lot of coal consumption, like concrete, like steel, will go into decline because they'll be building fewer apartment buildings, fewer mega projects, et cetera.
Sure.
And at the same time, there are public policies in China, for example, like a strong priority on on sort of energy security.
Right.
That actually work against coal because China actually consumes so much coal it has to import from other countries despite having very large coal reserves domestically. So there's an incentive to sort of scale down China's coal imports, which sort of puts downward pressure on coal as well. There's nuclear and renewable energy build outs, but on the other hand, there's also sort of a very strong domestic political pressure to sort of maintain, especially at the local and provincial levels, to maintain economic growth sort of by any means possible.
Right.
And certainly there are many ways in which that may manifest in sort of the same patterns of mega project driven, sort of housing driven models of local economic growth that would promote the steel and concrete industries and promote building coal power projects, et cetera. So the future is difficult to predict. And I think the most valuable thing that one can do is understand the various factors at play and sort of, think about the possible scenarios that might unfold and how those factors might be influenced.
Sure. Well, so I didn't necessarily want to just focus on China, but just quick, what's your take then on the Chinese nuclear sector? Because China is now building more nuclear reactors than any other country in the world. They deployed the world's first commercial gas-cooled reactor in Shandong province. Was it a year ago, December, something like that? It's this was a 200 megawatt reactor, if my memory serves. they are doing some cutting edge technology in terms of nuclear deployment, and they're deploying nuclear at a rate faster than any other country in the world. What's your view on their nuclear sector?
It's very interesting. China is doing a sort of an all of the above approach on sort of on building the next generation of reactors, from very conventional large light water designs like the domestically produced Hualong design, downscaled versions of the Hualong that are more in the SMR category, other advanced SMR designs like the HTGR you mentioned, and also they're investing in sort of thorium fueled liquid metal fast reactors. It's like almost every category of reactor that you can name. China is at least trying to build sort of pilot scale demonstration projects. And at the same time, sort of the large light water reactor program has been very successful. It's very clear, just even from sort of an external perspective, that this program has achieved notable rates of learning in driving down nuclear costs and success in delivering projects sort of on time. One notable statistic I like to share, let me just dig it up here real quickly, I'll
let you concentrate on that. I'll give you a station break while you look it up, and I'll talk and you search there.
Sure.
My guest is Seaver Wang. He is the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. You can find out more about them at thebreakthrough.org. And Seaver is on Twitter at Wang_Seaver, Seaver. So you were looking up one fact. Did you find it?
Yes. So the other thing is that China has been very successful in exporting its reactor designs abroad. Most recently to Pakistan, where China recently built two new Hualong 1 reactors at the site of the Karachi nuclear power plant in Pakistan. And the construction statistics on those two reactors are quite eye-opening. The first of those units, Karachi 2, was completed in 5 years, 9 months, and 8 days. The third unit at that plant, the second unit that the Chinese built, was completed in 5 years, 9 months, and 7 days. So that's a consistency in build time of a difference of 1 day.
Right.
So that's really quite remarkable, and it's actually no wonder now that so many new export deals for China's reactors, like the one they recently signed in Argentina, are starting to flow in.
And so those, it's interesting because I lectured a group of Pakistanis here in the U.S. Fairly recently about their power issues, and they're desperately power short in Pakistan and have been. Their grid problems are enormous. So you're talking about the Karachi 2 and Karachi 3 reactors then? So how big are those? What's the capacity of those?
It's around 1 gigawatt, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was the cost of that project?
That I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Okay, right. Well, so of course, comparing labor costs in between China and Asia and the U.S. is difficult, right? Because of different customs, different sourcing of labor, different labor laws. But the Chinese are able to build them faster and cheaper than we are, and they are doing just that, right? But what about their nuclear fuel supply? Are they? That may be too far in the weeds. Let's leave that alone and go back, if you don't mind, because we've taken a kind of a detour into China, which I think is interesting, endlessly fascinating. And I've had Peter Zion on the podcast, and he's very bearish on China, very bearish on China's demographics. But just back to Fukushima, if you don't mind, because I want to just finish up that part, and then let's talk about solar. I was at Fukushima Daiichi in late February, and it was a very sobering experience. I mean, I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but to see what, the depopulation of the prefecture, which was a mistake, and it's well known that it was a mistake to move everyone out. But I guess the question that I want to tee up is, Japan doesn't really have a choice. They have to start releasing this water, because I was there. I saw, it's one thing to say they have 1,000 tanks full of water. It's another thing to see it. And I saw 1,000 tanks of water, and it's just a staggering volume of water that they are going to have to put into the ocean, because I guess the question is this: is it fair to say Japan doesn't have a choice? They have to put this tritiated water into the ocean. Is that fair?
Well, yes, that's not the way I would frame it.
Okay. I mean, how would you approach it?
I mean, the way I would put it is that, this water has been treated to like a standard better arguably than tritiated water releases from other nuclear power plants sort of around the world. So, it's all within, standard process for sort of existing industry, power, etc. And so there's no reason not to release it. And on the point of the land, it's actually unclear, it's unclear that there isn't more room to store this water if the Japanese government wanted to, but there's just there's no reason to. The water's been treated. It's at an absolutely safe standard, and so why would they keep building storage plants? Really, I don't think it's so much of a matter of choice as there isn't really a choice. It's which I guess is similar to what you just said, but it's not that there is it's not that there's just really a choice to begin with. The water is safe, so what's the reason to keep building storage plants?
And so, or I guess I'd feed that back to you, read it back to you, is just saying, well, let's get over this insane fear of this minute level of radiation and move on, right? That's what we have to do, that this is safe and the IAEA has declared it safe. So let's make it happen. But is it true then, because I read the Friends of the Earth publication about the water release, and I forgot who took them to task, but it was a thorough debunking of what the Friends of the Earth have been saying about this tritiated water release. You're with an NGO. I've been in NGOs before. I won't do it again. I've had that experience. It was fine. But is this part of the NGO playbook, that these anti-nuclear NGOs have to continue to stir up fear to appeal to their base? Why would they put out such an obviously unprovable, or obviously exaggerating the risks? What's in it for these NGOs that are amping up nuclear fear?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have access to Friends of the Earth sort of detailed, books of how much revenue they get from small donors, large donors, etc. But certainly, Friends of the Earth is explicitly founded as an organization opposed to nuclear energy, and they were founded to oppose nuclear energy in California. So they have this sort of founding principle of opposition, and for an organization that's been around for that long, it's sort of understood that that's what you're asking these advocates to sort of do. How that's sort of the frame that you're asking these advocates to look at problems with. And so I think that as a result, it's sort of natural for organizations like Friends of the Earth, then, who were founded with this sort of agenda and with this sort of mandate to look at these problems in a certain way. And so they're looking for they see it they see their job as to be the watchdogs, the ones to try and scrutinize and be like, I don't believe that number on what the tritium dose would actually be. And so that's the role that such organizations have sort of given themselves to play in sort of civil society discourse. And I don't think that they would disagree with that either. So that is the context with which one should interpret sort of work coming out of organizations like Friends of the Earth.
Well, so I've written about this, and I'm sure you've thought about it. And Breakthrough Institute, which I've followed for a long time, I interviewed Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus now maybe 15 years ago, when they, I think even before they started Breakthrough. So been following, Breakthrough for a long time, and Michael Schellenberger's work, of course. Is nuclear generally in the U.S., is it passing a tipping point? Is there a new paradigm afoot now after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and with now Japan restarting its reactors? Or are you seeing a change in thinking, or is it still an uphill fight with outfits like Friends of the Earth and other, I would say disinformers around nuclear? Have things started to change? Do you perceive a change in sentiment?
I mean, it depends on where you look. So first off, one very encouraging sign is that public polling in the United States, by Pew, the polling major player in the United States, has shown increasing support for nuclear power over the last decade.
Yeah,
and that's bipartisan as well. And then, which points to another very encouraging sign, which is that nuclear energy is one of the few areas that you can get a divided Congress and sort of a divided American political landscape to agree upon, that this is a important sort of energy source that helps with sort of American energy security, American climate goals, et cetera, that should be prioritized. And so those are very, strong tailwinds that it's worth noting. That's worth noting and sort of appreciating. At the same time, there are still headwinds. We have a nuclear regulatory framework that makes it very difficult for sort of new reactor designs that don't conform to sort of traditional technologies to get themselves licensed, to get construction licenses, et cetera, and which sort of prevents us from sort of building these things on nearer term timescales. So perhaps some policy shifts there would be appropriate. And then, as we saw just a few weeks ago with Governor Pritzker's veto of the repeal of the longstanding nuclear moratorium in Illinois, there are still very strong political constituencies that are sort of irrationally opposed to the technology, even to the point of just wasting the time of sort of American policymakers by advocating for a veto that would just fail against a veto-proof majority in the Illinois legislature. So really, this is just a time-wasting exercise, right? So, and then I think there's one other heavy headwind that I would mention, which is economic, which is, utilities are sort of a little gun shy of nuclear, reluctant to spend, the large amounts of capital up front, especially on sort of first of a kind nuclear power plant designs. And so, in a market sense, that's a set of obstacles that needs to be overcome as well. So I wouldn't even necessarily say that I'm optimistic or pessimistic, just that, a lot of work has to be done, but there is a lot of positive progress.
Yeah, I think that's a fair. I think that's a fair assessment. A lot of work has to be done, and I just add one thing, which is that people forget the scale of the U.S. electric grid and how big it is. 1.25 terawatts, and so okay, Vogtle 3 and 4 are coming online. That's 2,000 megawatts. Well, I mean, we're decimal dust in the big picture in the U.S. in terms of making a significant dent in the overall electric generation fleet. You wrote a piece recently called the title was "What the 100% Renewables Literature Gets Wrong." What do they get wrong?
Yeah, so this was a critique.
you have less than 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. This was a critique of very bold claims that you see again in sort of international advocacy, but also in research communities, and even sort of parroted by policymakers that everything's solved. We have all that you can just go straight to 100% renewables everywhere in the world. It'll look the same pretty much anywhere. It's technically and economically feasible, and also that such a transition pathway, some researchers assert, would actually be cheaper than the fossil fuel status quo. Renewables are the cheapest source of electricity available today, and so it's actually better to do, more cost effective to do this than to continue burning fossil fuels. And I really, having reviewed a lot of this research, my critique looked at, I read in detail 86 of the papers that are cited in support of this claim, specifically in the Asia and Africa context, and saw that there were some real methodological flaws. Some of these papers are very poor quality. They're either just review papers, they're papers that don't do any actual analysis, and even the papers that do some modeling, they're using very generalized cost assumptions that are too low. They're assuming very optimistic development of things like direct air carbon capture, and then turning that into synthetic, renewable green methane that you can burn in gas turbines to provide sort of dispatchable, firm, flexible power to balance out variations in renewable generation. And so my main point was that this research, it cannot make the strong claims that are being bandied about, that this has been solved, it's possible everywhere, and it's super cheap. That simply has not been demonstrated with these modeling studies or these other research papers.
And this is something that I have to say, Seaver, that I just, I see it over and over, and I see the same people quoted in the big legacy media outlets over and over and over again. Oh, we're just going to build terawatts of new renewables, and we're going to, put it out there, where all those hicks live, and it's all going to be great. And it's, the assumptions upon the assumptions upon the assumptions, as I look at it, and I just think, you've never been to Christiana, Wisconsin. You've never been to Ida Township, Michigan, where these people are saying, we don't want these projects. And so I look at it from kind of a different, I haven't read 86 papers. I'm not going to read 86 papers. I'm glad you did. But I look at it from just starting from the land use, which is Lee Cordner says, where are you going to put it? Right. And that's where I start. Right. And that's the main friction point that I see. Did you look at not tooting my own horn, just making that observation? Did you look at the land use parts of this? Or I didn't read your full paper here, but I've scanned your summary. Did you look at the land use assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, two things I'll point out. One thing is that the most advanced models that were among these 86 papers were still simple sort of node and stick models of the electricity system with less than 30 nodes to represent entire countries. So obviously it's not a geographically resolved model like, for example, Dr. Christopher Chris Clack's vibrant energy model, which has 3-kilometer resolution for the United States. So it's a world apart, and so as a result, it simplifies those land use problems. And then these models, of course, do not at all consider political obstacles to renewable energy deployment. So these are headwinds that these models are explicitly not taking into account.
My summary form is spreadsheet jockeys, because I just look at them and I just think, it's easy to make a spreadsheet to come to some arrived conclusion, but you're not considering all the opposition, both to the physical plant itself, but also the high voltage transmission, where you're going to get the transformers. So let's talk about supply chains, because you mentioned supply chains and you've written about this before. Let's talk about Simon Michaud first, because Simon's been on the podcast. And you wrote, along with several others, I think fair to say a rebuttal or a rejoinder to his work. Michaud's work says we don't have enough metals and minerals. We can't meet this massive demand for new metals and minerals through the alternative energy technology deployment, because the quality of the ores is getting worse. The production is in fact leveling out or going down in many copper mines. So give us a brief summary of the paper that you read or that you co-authored that was a response to Simon Michaud's work.
So our paper was actually, I'm not sure if it came actually before Simon Michaud's work, but it's sort of competing work. Okay. Because we basically looked at exactly the same analysis. Right. And we came at it with in very different ways. So basically the fundamental question that both of us were looking at is, how many minerals will a global energy transition need? So Michaud sort of independently sort of came up with a ballpark figure of how many solar panels, wind farms, and batteries the world would need between now out to 2050, I think it was. Whereas we took sort of IPCC modeling, which sort of uses integrated assessment modeling to calculate out based on things like economic development, population growth, growth in energy demand, et cetera, what the global sort of energy footprint would look like in 2050. And we looked at 75 different scenarios that were included in the IPCC's 1.5 degrees Celsius report. So I think our approach is a lot more robust for actually sort of backing out how many solar panels, wind farms, et cetera, that the world would need by 2050. People also critique Simon Michaud's study for assuming that all storage needs would be met by sort of lithium-ion batteries, not just lithium-ion batteries, but also nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries, which is just not the case realistically. Even for battery storage, those are moving to lithium iron phosphate or sodium-ion batteries. And it's more likely that for the seasonal storage, it doesn't make sense to have a battery that you charge once in the summer and then discharge once in December, right, to cover seasonal storage. That would probably look like something else in the 100% renewables framework, like hydrogen or something like that. So I'd say Simon Michaud's scenario construction was very aggressive. And so I think that his minerals estimates are far too high.
But what about the mines themselves? Okay, so fair enough. But is it half? Is it a quarter? I mean, because still, when I looked at Michaud's work, whether you cut it in half, I mean, that's kind of how I do my bullshit detection is, okay, well, assume this is wrong by half. Is that even half feasible? And that was the part that looked daunting to me, that the numbers are so big right? So, but your response is, oh no, we can achieve this if we do a radical increase in mining. How big are your numbers in terms? Let's set Micho aside. How much more copper are we going to need for? Let's start with that one because that's the one everyone talks about. How much under your scenario? How much more copper are we going to have to mine?
Yeah, so in my models, it's suggested that even under very ambitious climate decarbonization pathways, you might be talking like 12% or 20% of current global copper demand on top of what we already need. And so, to flip that same exercise that you applied to Simon Micho's work around, let's say you quintuple that amount, that my estimate, you'd still be, it's still less than a full doubling of sort of the rate of global copper production today. And so, and there's also, factors working in favor of fewer metals. Like you get better at doing more with less. Technology gets better. Cell phones have gotten a lot. Get more minerals get less minerals intensive over time, et cetera. And I think also fundamentally what we're running into is a bit of a tension between Simon Micho, who's a little more pessimistic about sort of limits to growth and limits to mining ability, and my position more as an eco-modernist, where I think humans are smart. We always figure ways around these sorts of limits. Where it's like, okay, I don't know if it's seafloor metals or advanced recycling or asteroid mining, but I don't think these limits are fundamentally constraining. I think that whenever humans have encountered a shortage, we found ways to overcome it. And that's been the story in mining. Heck, we can get better at recovering more metal from things that we consider to be mine waste today, for example. So that's a factor that might run counter to the declining ore grades argument. So the future ultimately is hard to predict, but I think there's a lot of moving parts. And I'll just note that I really think that Simon Micho is not accounting for a lot of those moving parts.
Yeah, and I take your point. I guess I can see it both ways, right? That and this is the history of the oil and gas industry. Oh, we're running out, right? And we're reaching, the peak is coming right here. And when we're running out of nat gas, right? Remember, it was just 15, less than 20, less than 20 years ago, U.S. was saying we're going to have to import LNG because there's no more gas to be found in the U.S. And now we're approaching 100 billion cubic feet a day. But I look at, and maybe it's because I don't know as much about hard rock mining, but I maybe it is different. Maybe it is different in hard rock mining because if it's the quantity of material that has to be moved, et cetera. So I can kind of examine that problem in both from both directions. But I want to read back to what you said, that you think, and just if we look at copper, that the demand growth, you think that existing mines, existing networks, we could increase that by 15 to 20% a year, and that would be enough to meet demand for this increase in alt energy. Have I heard you correctly?
The per year total rate of copper demand, societal per year total rate of copper demand might increase by 20% or so. But like,
and is that physically possible? I guess though that's the crux of the thing. I mean, is that in part because of geopolitics, right? And there was Doomberg had a good piece on this the other day about the geopolitics in Peru and other places and even in the US, right? The Pebble mine in Alaska, getting those things permitted. So you think it's feasible then, given existing, I'm just asking this very clearly, that it's feasible to make that 20% increase?
I mean, but on the other hand, the Oyu Tolgoi mine, which is one of the richest copper deposits ever identified on Earth, just started production, I think, within the last few months or a year or so.
Oh, right.
That's in Mongolia. So, for everything you can point to, there's sort of a counterpoint. And another counterpoint I'd mention is that, all of this conversation around whether terrestrial resources suffice hasn't considered, marine resources, for example. There could be more than enough copper in, sub seafloor nodules to really sort of obviate any concerns that we ever have about copper.
Gotcha.
In theory, maybe we won't choose to exploit those deposits, but I don't think that sort of the Earth's geology is fundamentally constraining.
Well, let's talk about solar panels now here, because this is another issue that I find interesting that I've written about, and I've followed Laura Murphy's work, and she wrote a paper that just recently came out. And you wrote about solar and I have solar panels on the roof of my house. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar panels. They're made by LG in Korea. Do they have, is it possible they have some content from Xinjiang? I suppose it's possible. But you wrote in February, you wrote, quote, if the climate community still can't even talk meaningfully about Xinjiang, then it's time to stop pretending the solar supply chain problem is anywhere close to being solved. Michael Schellenberger has famously called them genocide solar panels. And the U.S. State Department, Commerce, Trade, I think 6 agencies of the U.S. have labeled what's happening in Xinjiang as genocide. These are strong. That's a very strong word, particularly be coming from U.S. government and from multiple agencies in the U.S. government. Is there genocide happening against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang?
Well, I believe that's the term I would use. And I would also point out that you don't have to go to Michael Schellenberger or to the US government to find language that's this strong. The United Nations actually has published multiple human rights reports just in the last year and a half or so that have labeled these crimes against humanity. It is a state-sponsored campaign of sort of cultural erasure. The Chinese government doesn't want this region, speaking a different language or worshiping a different faith or practicing traditional customs. This is a very deliberate sort of program that, to your point earlier, is it like what is going on in China? It's always sort of it's always difficult to get information about China, and as such, I think it's very telling the amount of information that has actually come out of China, whether it's satellite imagery or reports from survivors or reports from relatives abroad that have people interned in this concentration camp system. The fact that stuff can actually escape the Great Firewall to such a degree that the United Nations can deem sufficient evidence that they're concerned that crimes against humanity are happening on the ground. Really, I think that's very telling.
Well, so by saying that, I'm just, I don't have desire to go to China, but by you saying that, it's possible that you could be barred from going to China.
Having published, reports on concerns about human rights violations in the solar supply chain, I don't think it would be a good idea for me personally to travel to China. I have no plans to do so, pending dramatic changes in the political landscape.
And that it seems to be the attitude of a lot of people who are doing this kind of work, that they know that possibility of going to China is now, it's not going to happen. And I'm okay with that. There are a lot of other places I'd rather visit. But Laura Murphy has done some remarkable reporting on this. She's at she's based in the UK. I'm trying to remember the name of her university. Hallam University is Sheffield Hallam. Mm-hmm. Yeah. She has a new report out, and she did, I think it was, not just coincidental timing. After her report in broad daylight came out, I think in late 2021, it was only a few months later that the U.S. government issued very strong statements about genocide in the Uyghur region in China. She wrote that the Uyghur region now accounts for approximately 35% of the world's polysilicon, down from 45%, and as much as 32% of global metallurgical grade silicon production, and that the vast majority of the modules produced globally continue to have exposure to the Uyghur region, and that production in China significantly increases exposure. Some of the world's largest module manufacturers appear to have bifurcated their supply chains to create a product line that they claim to be free of the Xinjiang Xinjiang Autonomous Region. I don't know what the U stands for, though evidence of these claims varies by supplier. So is it possible, it's a long introduction, to know whether solar panels that are imported into the U.S. are free of Chinese slave labor?
I think it is possible to determine whether a panel is free of slave labor, provided you have the right chain of paper documents. Right. So for example, to take your LG panels that LG is making now, I'm sure in order to make it into the U.S. past existing import restrictions that target products made in Xinjiang, those importers have to provide very detailed documentation on not only where each module was manufactured, but where each supply chain commodity that went into those modules, going all the way back to the quartz rock that's mined to make the polysilicon. They have to provide a paper trail for all of that. So I think panels that are able to demonstrate to show where they're getting all this stuff from, it's easy enough for them to show that 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 their product is free. The question is, the rest of the industry. And I really think that a major question there is the degree to which sort of the Chinese solar manufacturers are able/willing to comply with such paperwork, or whether they simply try to put their products onto markets where such restrictions are not in place. And also a question of whether sort of constituencies that want to prioritize sort of clean energy deployment and sort of see this supply chain ethics scrutiny as a potential obstacle to deployment, whether the degree to which they sort of resist these restrictions and sort of call for their overturn, et cetera.
You use the term clean energy. What makes something clean energy?
I mean, some people are very. So
I asked that with. I mean, it's a provocative question, but I asked that because, solar has had this halo effect around it. To quote, I forgot, is the guy at San Jose State. It has this halo, right? Oh, it's solar, therefore it's clean. But if it's using Uyghur slave labor, it's not so clean, is it? I mean, this. So what is? I interrupted you, but I just had to interject that. So what distinguishes clean energy from everything else?
I mean, so I think, so I agree with you. There's no such thing as energy that just, has no environmental consequences other than like the scent of roses and spring water. Every energy source has some negative environmental trade-off,
right.
no matter what, hydro, wind, solar, even nuclear. We acknowledge that, but energy is valuable enough that we accept that trade-off, and we work on making that trade-off better and better. So clean energy to me is just a shorthand for low carbon energy. I maybe I would peg it at ideally under 75 or 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Some organizations like the IPCC or the European Commission actually have defined thresholds for that. I think it's worth remembering when we say the word clean energy that there are environmental consequences on the other side of that. But at the same time, I think there's only so much practicality with which one can sort of police one's own language every time one says clean to caveat that. So I think it's an acceptable shorthand. But fundamentally, I agree with you. There's no such thing as energy without sort of some environmental consequences.
Yeah. Fair enough. And I think the language is really important. I don't use fossil fuels. I say hydrocarbons because I think it's a more, a better term, right? It's more inclusive and not as, but that's a side note. When we talked back we chatted when we were in California in June, and we talked about a solar deployment in Angola. And as I recall, you were rather cynical about it. I think that's the right word. I'm not trying to portray your comments as in a way that you wouldn't approve of, but the Export-Import Bank of the United States approved a $900 million loan to Angola to put in a solar project. As I recall, you were not very bullish on the prospects for that. Why was that?
Well, rather, I think it illustrates the real obstacles to renewable energy deployment in low-income and middle-income developing countries, especially some of the poorest countries on Earth, where you're trying to deploy this infrastructure, variable renewable energy infrastructure, into an already energy-scarce country with insufficient sort of infrastructure to sort of balance around that variability. So I think these projects, it's arriving at a lot higher cost. Like especially if you think about something like a wind deployment in a country where most transportation is taking place over unpaved roads that are closed for much of the year, due to rainfall, et cetera. And then you also think about sort of the financing factors. There's a significant cost premium associated with deploying renewables in low-income countries compared to in the developed world. In the developed world, solar deployments, wind deployments, they have gotten a lot cheaper. But the same is not necessarily true of countries where a loan comes with a much higher interest rate attached to that loan. This goes back to
and sorry to interrupt, but that's due to the political risk, right? Due to the political risk of the company that's doing the deployment, right? That there could be a change in government, they won't get paid back, and is that why they're
some economic risk to what if your contractor runs away with the money or something like that,
right? Yeah.
All of which I think will get better over time. As these countries sort of develop economically, and sort of, improve, structures of government accountability and so forth. But this goes back to the paper that the sort of papers that we were critiquing earlier, these 100% renewables papers, which I think it's really important to avoid this narrative that it's easy for deploying this stuff is easy and cheap for everyone. We have to really realistically represent the scales of the challenges that these countries face. Because when the priority is expanding electricity to every household and setting up basic industry so that these countries can achieve economic development and sort of achieve a standard of life closer to what we enjoy in the rich world today, we have to be really honest about what the obstacles that they confront are, so that we can actually solve the problems that are out there.
Yeah, I like that kind of characterization, because this idea that, oh, well, of course, wind and solar are cheaper, and that if you look at the power purchase agreements lately, that's not the case. They're actually increasing in cost. But yes, it ignores the human infrastructure, the physical infrastructure challenges in these countries that I think are going to be obvious. So you mentioned energy transition before. Is there an energy transition happening?
I mean, I think like one sign that I point to, for example, is the fact that some car companies are shuttering their internal combustion engine research arms because they don't think they'll be making internal combustion engines in the future. And that, to me, you can talk about, changes in primary energy versus electricity and whatever at a global level. But, stuff like that, the fact that, major leading global automakers are saying we have produced our last generation of internal combustion engines and we're moving over to the future is electric. That, to me, communicates that there is an energy transition happening in the world. How fast that energy transition takes place, open question. Is it fast enough to meet some people's sort of preferences? Remains to be seen. A lot of work to be done to either make that possible or reconcile those expectations. But I think it is happening slowly, but happening.
Fair enough. So I don't know if you've listened to my podcast, but I ask all of my guests the same questions at the end. What are you reading? I know you're busy. Do you have writing and researching? Do you have reading books on your if so, what are you reading at the moment?
So I just you caught me sort of in between reading at the moment. The most recent book that I actually finished reading was Solar Power Finance Without the Jargon by Jenny Chase, which is a fun, accessibly written sort of primer on sort of solar energy as it stands.
Give me the title.
She's coming out with an update.
Give me the title again, please.
Solar Power Finance Without the Jargon, I think it is.
Okay.
But my understanding is she's coming out with an updated version in the next year or so. So maybe you can, so listeners may want to hold out for that updated edition shortly. I've also actually been reading a lot of Japanese energy system modeling papers more recently, which are quite interesting. Japan actually has a very sort of vibrant and active energy system modeling research community, and they put out some interesting work.
Yeah, Japan, I told you I was in Japan. It was a fascinating country. And my takeaway is I wrote on my Substack with the title was Japan no Kyoto. I mean, they have, I did not see any dedication to the energy transition there. I saw dedication to energy security, but that's an aside. I think, it's a very interesting country. They're restarting their nuclear reactors, but they're also building coal and gas plants. The last question then, Seaver, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Technology. And also sort of human ingenuity. I think we are, compared to where I was, 10 or 15 years ago, I came to all of this work. I got my degree in oceanography. I came to work at Breakthrough because I cared about, climate change, solving environmental problems, and creating a better tomorrow for humans writ large. Where humans are more prosperous, more safe, more secure. And compared to where I was in around 2010 as a young student, I was a lot more hopeless around the state of the world. And I really think that it is technology that has given me a lot of hope about that. And also one thing I'd say is also sort of changes in human awareness. We're more globally connected now. We're more conscious of problems that are happening on the other world. I do think we genuinely care more. We're more sort of globally empathetic. able to reach out in sort of unprecedented ways in the wake of natural disasters or human conflict in ways that haven't happened before. And obviously, humans aren't perfect. There's a lot of bad things happen in the world. People continue to do a lot of bad things to one another. But I also sort of see a lot of empowerment of the good, and that gives me hope when it comes to tackling big problems like energy problems, environmental problems, climate problems, and so the problems that we create are on our own for one another.
So if I'm going to read back just a little snippet of what I heard you say, so you're more hopeful in your 30s than you were in your 20s.
Yeah. That's safe to say.
Well, you said as a student, and so I'm just extrapolating out here the numbers. So, and is that just, it's the technology, but also just a little more experience that you look around and you see that there more reason for hope as you get a little older?
I suppose you could. I mean, I still feel young at heart. But perhaps I've learned a bit more. Yes.
Well, let's hope so. And that's a good place to stop.
Always
My guest has been Seaver Wang. He is the co-director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Breakthrough Institute. He's written some very perceptive things on what's going on in energy and climate, energy and supply chains. He's on Twitter at Wang_Seaver. You can also find his work at thebreakthrough.org. Seaver, thanks a lot for your time. It's been fun to chat, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks again for having me on.
And to all of you out there in podcast land, tune into the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Until then, see ya.